During a peace offering dinner, my son toasted to our future, unaware I'd just received a text warning me to flee immediately. I thought we were healing, but the whiskey was drugged and my life was the price of his secret debt. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The waiter set the check down, but my son Rick swiped it before I could even reach for my glasses. He laughed, a bright, expensive sound that didn't match the boy who used to hide behind my legs when the neighbors said hello. We were sitting in a steakhouse in Montclair that cost more per plate than my first car, and for the first time in 365 days, we weren't shouting. We were a family again, or at least a convincing imitation of one. My daughter-in-law Emma reached across the white linen and squeezed my hand, her silk sleeve whispering against the table. She told me how much they missed having me around, how the house felt empty without my stories. I felt a lump form in my throat, a mix of relief and the lingering ache of losing my wife Margaret 2 years ago. I reached into my pocket for a handkerchief, but my fingers brushed my phone instead. It buzzed against my palm, a frantic, rhythmic vibration that felt like a warning. I pulled it out, expecting a restaurant manager or a late delivery. Instead, a message from a number I didn't recognize flashed on the screen in all capital letters. It said, "Get up and go now. Don't say anything to your son." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I looked up at Rick, who was busy swirling a 25-year-old scotch in a crystal glass. He looked successful. He looked happy. He looked nothing like a man I needed to flee from. I looked at the phone again, the harsh white light of the screen stinging my eyes. The message was still there, a digital scream in the middle of a peaceful dinner. Emma was watching me now, her head tilted, her perfect smile faltering just a fraction. She asked if everything was okay at the restaurants. I lied and said it was just a minor inventory issue, but the hand holding my water glass was shaking. I thought about Margaret. She always told me that when your gut speaks, you don't ask for a second opinion. I stood up so fast my chair barked against the hardwood floor. I told them I had a sudden, sharp pain in my chest and needed to get to my medicine in the car. Rick started to rise, his face twisting into a mask of concern that felt a second too late. I told him to stay, to finish his drink, that I'd be right back. I didn't look back as I walked through the foyer, past the heavy oak doors and into the cool Jersey night. The Uber I'd called 10 minutes earlier was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the suburban darkness. I climbed in, my breath coming in ragged hitches. The driver asked if I was all right, and I just told him to drive toward Brooklyn. As we merged onto the highway, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the same unknown number. I answered on the first ring, my voice sounding like gravel. A woman's voice, low and urgent, told me I was lucky I got out. She told me my son owed $2.3 million to people who didn't take IOUs. She said the whiskey I'd been drinking was spiked with something called zetrulum to make me agreeable. My head started to swim, the lights of the passing cars blurring into long neon streaks. The woman told me Rick had legal papers in his pocket, ready for me to sign away my entire life's work the moment the drug hit my system. I looked at my hands, the weathered skin of a man who had spent 40 years building an empire of 7 restaurants. Everything Margaret and I had worked for was a signature away from vanishing. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. He asked if I needed a hospital. I told him no. I needed a police station. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. I thought about Rick's graduation, the Navy suit I'd worn, the pride that had nearly burst my buttons. It had all been a long con. The Montclair mansion, the luxury cars, the silk dresses. It was all a theater built on debt and desperation. The woman on the phone, who I realized was Maria, the housekeeper I'd seen earlier, told me they were already looking for me. She said Rick was frantic, that he knew his 11-day deadline with the loan sharks was ticking down. If he didn't get my restaurants, he was a dead man. I felt a cold iron settle in my gut. I told the driver to pull over at the next precinct. I wasn't going to hide in Brooklyn. I was going to finish this where it started. I walked into the station, the fluorescent lights humming a jagged tune. I told the officer at the desk that my son was trying to poison me. It sounded insane, like a movie script, until I pulled out my phone and showed him the texts. I told him about the whiskey, the papers, the millions in debt. They brought me into a small room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. A detective named Harrison listened to me, his face unreadable as I laid out the history of the last year. The silence, the sudden invitation, the rehearsed warmth of my daughter-in-law. He told me that if I wanted to catch them, I had to go back. I had to be the bait. He said they'd have officers in place, but I had to walk back into that house and sit at that table. I looked at the wedding photo of Margaret in my wallet. She looked so brave. I closed the wallet and told the detective I was ready. The drive back to Montclair felt like a trip to the gallows. Every street lamp we passed felt like a spotlight on my own stupidity. How could I have been so blind? I had wanted to believe the lie so badly that I'd ignored the smell of the trap. Detective Harrison was in an unmarked car 2 minutes behind me. He told me through a hidden earpiece to keep them talking, to wait for them to bring out the papers. I stepped out of the Uber at the foot of Rick's circular driveway. The fountain was still dancing, the water sparkling under the garden lights. But now it looked like something out of a horror story. The stone columns of the house felt like the bars of a cage. I took a deep breath, tasted the salt of my own sweat, and walked to the front door. Rick opened it before I could even reach for the handle. His face was pale, his eyes darting to the street behind me. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight enough to bruise. He asked where the hell I'd been, his voice cracking. I played the part of the confused old man. I told him the air in the restaurant had been too thick, that I'd gotten turned around in the parking lot and had to sit down. I watched Emma appear in the hallway, her silk dress shimmering. She looked like a predator that had just seen its prey return to the clearing. She ushered me toward the dining room, her voice a high, artificial trill. She said she'd made tea, that we needed to get me warm and settled. I sat back down in that same mahogany chair, the weight of the betrayal pressing against my lungs. Maria was in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes a frantic rhythm. I caught her eye for a split second as she brought in a tray of tea. Her hands were shaking so hard the porcelain clicked like chattering teeth. She didn't look at Rick or Emma. She looked only at me, a silent plea in her gaze. Rick sat to my right, leaning in close. He smelled of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. He pushed a glass toward me, the amber liquid inside swirling with a strange oily film. He told me it was a special blend, something to settle my nerves. I knew what was in it. I knew that every sip was a step toward my own destruction. I picked up the glass, feeling the cold crystal against my palm. I told them I wanted to talk about the future. I saw Rick's posture change, his shoulders dropping an inch. He thought he had me. He started talking about the restaurants, about how hard it was for me to manage 7 locations at my age. He said he'd been talking to some investors, that he could take the burden off my back. Emma nodded along, her eyes fixed on the glass in my hand. She told me I deserved a rest, that Margaret would have wanted me to enjoy my sunset years without worrying about payroll and property taxes. They were using my dead wife as a lever to pry my life away from me. I felt a surge of anger so hot it nearly broke my cover. I brought the glass to my lips, letting the liquid touch my tongue, but not swallowing. It tasted bitter, like burnt plastic. Rick reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a fountain pen and a stack of legal documents. He laid them on the table with a practiced, casual grace. He told me it was just a simple power of attorney, something to help him help me. I looked at the top page. It was a total transfer of assets. Every brick, every stove, every dollar in the business accounts. My son was asking me to sign my own death warrant while smiling at me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the stranger he'd become. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike was gone. In his place was a man who had gambled away his soul and now wanted to spend mine. I picked up the pen, my fingers trembling. I asked him if he was sure this was what he wanted. The room went silent, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Rick's eyes were locked on the pen. He said of course he was sure, that he loved me, that he just wanted us to be a family again. I looked at Emma. She was leaning forward, her breath shallow. They were so close they could taste the money. I thought about the $2.3 million the housekeeper had mentioned. I wondered who Rick had lost it to, what kind of people were waiting for him to deliver. I realized then that they weren't just greedy, they were terrified. They had built a life of glass and the stones were already flying. I lowered the pen to the signature line, the ink bead at the tip looking like a drop of black blood. I looked at Rick and asked him how much he owed. The question hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face going from pale to a sickly gray. He tried to laugh it off, asking what I was talking about. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. I told him I knew about the gambling, I knew about the loan sharks, I knew about the zetrulum in the glass. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Emma's perfect mask shattered, her mouth falling open in a silent gasp. Rick didn't move. He just stared at me, the pen still in my hand. I told him that I'd been to the police, that they were outside right now. The transformation was instant. The son who had been pleading for family unity vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. Rick lunged across the table, his hand clawing for the documents. I shoved the table back, the heavy mahogany pinning him for a second. Emma screamed, a sharp piercing sound that cut through the house. She wasn't a graceful apparition anymore. She was a frantic conspirator. She grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the sideboard, her knuckles white. I saw the intent in her eyes. They weren't going to let me walk out again. They were too far gone. They had traded their humanity for a zip code in Montclair, and they were willing to kill to keep it. I backed toward the kitchen, my heart hammering a frantic code against my ribs. I shouted for the police, but the heavy oak doors and thick walls muffled my voice. Rick had scrambled around the table, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. He told me I was ruining everything, that I was an old man who didn't understand how the world worked. He said the money was his anyway, that he'd earned it by putting up with me for 30 years. The entitlement was a poison of its own. I felt a hand on my arm and spun around, ready to strike, but it was Maria. She pointed toward the back door, her eyes wide with terror. She whispered that the police were coming, but we had to get out now. We burst through the kitchen door just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The backyard was a maze of manicured hedges and expensive stone paths. I could hear Rick behind us, his footsteps heavy on the patio. He was shouting my name, but it wasn't a call for help. It was a threat. We ran toward the back gate, my lungs burning, my suit jacket feeling like lead. I tripped on a loose stone, my knee hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I looked back and saw Rick standing in the doorway, the light from the kitchen framing him like a silhouette of a demon. He had something in his hand, something dark and metallic. I scrambled to my feet, the pain in my knee a dull roar. Maria grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the shadows of a large oak tree. The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights reflecting off the low clouds. Rick was coming down the steps, his pace slow and deliberate. He wasn't running anymore. He knew the gate was locked from the outside. He thought he had us cornered in his perfect, expensive garden. He held a heavy iron fireplace poker, the tip gleaming in the moonlight. He told me to give him the papers, that he could still fix this if I just signed. He sounded like he was talking to a child, but the poker in his hand said something else entirely. I looked at the gate, then back at my son. I asked him if he really thought he could get away with this. He laughed, a jagged, broken sound. He said he'd already gotten away with it for a year. He told me he'd been siphoning money from the Brooklyn accounts for months, that the $2.3 million wasn't just gambling debt, it was the cost of keeping his secret. He'd been stealing from me, from the legacy I'd built for him. Every time I'd visited Margaret's grave and felt guilty for not talking to him, he'd been at a baccarat table spending her life's work. The betrayal felt like a cold blade in my marrow. I stood my ground, my back against the cold iron of the gate. The police cars roared into the circular driveway, their tires screaming on the pristine pavement. Bright spotlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the garden in harsh, flickering white. Rick froze, the poker dropping from his hand. He looked at the house, then at me, the reality of the situation finally crashing through his delusions. Emma was at the kitchen door, her hands over her face, her silk dress stained with tea and sweat. The front door burst open and a dozen officers flooded the foyer. Detective Harrison led the charge, his weapon drawn, his voice in authoritative thunder that filled the night. He ordered Rick to get on the ground. Rick didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at the blue lights as if they were a dream he could wake up from. Then he looked at me. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold, bitter hatred. He told me he wished I died with Margaret. The words hit harder than any iron poker ever could. I felt the last chord of my heart snap. I didn't say a word. I just watched as the officers tackled him to the grass, the plastic handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the hills of Montclair. Emma was led out of the house in tears, her designer heels clicking frantically on the stone. It was over. The theater was closed. I sat on the bumper of a patrol car, a gray blanket draped over my shoulders. Maria sat next to me, her head bowed. I thanked her for saving my life, and she just nodded, her eyes fixed on her worn shoes. I realized then that she'd risked everything, her job, her security, maybe her status, for a man who had barely noticed her. She had more honor in her pinky finger than my son had in his entire body. Detective Harrison came over, the stack of spiked whiskey glasses and forged documents in a plastic evidence bag. He told me they had enough to put them away for a long time. I looked at the house, the grand, empty mansion, and realized I was a billionaire in spirit and a pauper in family. The police station was a whirlwind of activity, but I felt like I was sitting in the eye of a hurricane. Everything was quiet and still inside my head. I gave my formal statement, my voice a steady drone as I recounted the poison, the theft, and the threats. I watched through a one-way mirror as Rick was processed. He looked small now, stripped of his expensive suit and his arrogance. He was just a middle-aged man who had traded his father's love for a high-stakes hand and lost. Emma was in another room, her voice rising in a frantic attempt to blame Rick for everything. She was a survivor, I realized. She would burn the world down to stay out of a cell. Detective Harrison sat across from me, a cup of lukewarm coffee between us. He told me that Rick's debts were even worse than Maria had heard. The $2.3 million was just the principal. With interest, he was in the hole for nearly $5. The people he owed were part of a syndicate that didn't go to court. They went to graveyards. Rick hadn't just been trying to steal my business. He'd been trying to save his own skin at the cost of mine. If I'd signed those papers, I wouldn't have lived a month. They would have staged an accident the moment the transfers were finalized. I took a sip of the coffee, but I couldn't taste it. I was thinking about the 7th location I'd opened in Queens, the one I'd named after Margaret. Rick had been there for the ribbon cutting. He'd hugged me and told me how proud he was. He'd been planning my murder even then. I asked about Maria. Harrison told me she was being looked after, but she was terrified. She had no place to go and no job. I told him to bring her to me. When she walked in, she looked like she expected to be arrested herself. I stood up and took her hands. I told her I had 7 restaurants and 7 managers, but I was about to open an 8th. I told her I needed someone who knew the value of a life, someone who could see a person when everyone else saw furniture. I offered her the job of general manager at my flagship location in Brooklyn. Her eyes filled with tears, a quiet, shaking sob escaping her. It wasn't charity, it was a debt I could never fully repay. As I walked out of the station, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I called an Uber to take me back to my modest brownstone in Brooklyn. I didn't want the luxury cars or the mansions. I wanted the smell of garlic and olive oil, the sound of a busy kitchen, and the memories of a woman who had taught me that a man's worth is measured by his word. I sat in the back of the car and pulled out my phone. I deleted Rick's number. I deleted Emma's number. I went into my photos and found a picture of Rick when he was 5, holding a wooden spatula in our first tiny kitchen. I stared at it for a long time. Then I hit delete. The brownstone was quiet when I arrived. I walked into the kitchen and saw the single plate, the single fork, and the single cup I'd washed the night before. I picked up Margaret's favorite coffee mug and held it to my chest. The refrigerator hummed its lonely tune, but the silence didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a clean slate. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Monday morning, 10 a.m., new beginning. I knew the next few months would be a nightmare of lawyers and depositions, of seeing my son behind glass and hearing his lies in open court. But as I watched the morning light fill the room, I knew I'd survive. I had my restaurants, I had my integrity, and I had the truth. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a year, I felt Margaret's hand on my shoulder, whispering that it was finally time to come home. I sat down at the small kitchen table and pulled a piece of stationery from the drawer. I began to write a letter to the staff at the Park Slope location, the ones who had worked for me since they were kids. I told them that things were going to change, that the family business was growing in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Margaret passed. I wasn't just a widower anymore, and I wasn't a victim. I was a builder. And as the city began to wake up outside my window, I realized that the text message hadn't just told me to get up and go. It had told me to start living again. I looked at the phone on the table, its screen dark and silent. The nightmare was over, but the story was just beginning. The trial was set for a sweltering Tuesday in August, the kind of New York day where the air feels like a wet wool blanket. I stood outside the courthouse in Manhattan, my navy suit pressed and my shoes polished until they reflected the city lights. I wasn't there as a grieving father anymore. I was a witness for the state. Detective Harrison met me at the top of the stone steps, his face grim. He told me that Emma had officially turned on Rick, taking a plea deal to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was going to tell the court everything about the gambling debts and the plan to use the Trulum to steal my life's work. I felt a sharp pang of irony. The woman who had promised to love my son through better or worse was the one who would ensure he spent his 45th birthday behind bars. Inside the courtroom, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that felt like a countdown. When they led Rick in, he didn't look toward me. He was thinner, his skin the color of old parchment, and the bravado that had fueled his life in Montclair had evaporated. He sat at the defense table, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve, while the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the $2.3 million debt, the underground poker logs, and the legal documents that would have handed him my empire. The prosecutor held up the crystal glass, the one containing the amber whiskey and the foreign sediment that had almost cost me my mind. Every eye in the room turned toward me, and for a second, I felt the old urge to protect him, to tell them it was all a mistake. But then I remembered the cold metal of the fireplace poker and his wish that I'd died with Margaret. I took the stand, the wood of the witness chair feeling solid and real under my hands. I looked directly at Rick, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor. I told the jury about the dinner, the rehearsed warmth, and the vibration of the phone in my pocket that changed everything. I spoke about Margaret and how we had built our restaurants from nothing, one plate of pasta and one satisfied customer at a time. I described the moment I realized my own son saw me as nothing more than a bank account to be emptied. When I finished, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning. Rick finally looked up, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to hold my hand in the park. Then his face hardened into a mask of resentment, and the boy vanished again. Emma took the stand next, her voice a fragile whisper that carried perfectly in the hushed room. She played her part well, casting herself as the terrified wife forced into a nightmare by a desperate husband. She detailed how Rick had researched the drug, how he'd monitored my whiskey consumption, and how he'd planned to have me sign the papers while I was too incoherent to understand the fine print. She even mentioned Maria, calling her a disloyal servant, a phrase that made my blood boil. I saw Maria sitting in the back row, her head held high, her eyes steady. She had more dignity in her silent observation than Emma had in her entire rehearsed testimony. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a confused old man with a fading memory, suggesting that the anonymous text was a hallucination triggered by grief. He asked if I was sure about the numbers, if I was sure about the debt, if I was sure my son wasn't just trying to help me retire. I didn't get angry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the printout of the text message. "Get up and go now. Don't say anything to your son." I told him that my memory was fine, but my heart was broken, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change the truth of what happened in that Montclair dining room. As I stepped down from the stand, Rick's lawyer whispered something to him, and Rick let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed like a gunshot. The jury didn't take long, only 4 hours to decide the fate of the man I'd raised. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, Rick looked like he was bracing for a blow. Guilty on all counts: attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse. The judge, a woman with eyes as sharp as flint, didn't show any mercy. She spoke about the sanctity of the family bond and how Rick had turned that bond into a weapon. She sentenced him to 18 years in a maximum security facility. Emma was sentenced to 5 years, her plea deal sparing her the worst of it, but still stripping away the life of luxury she'd killed to maintain. As they led Rick away in handcuffs, he stopped in front of my row. For the first time in the entire trial, he spoke directly to me, his voice a low hiss that only I could hear. He told me that the loan sharks would find me, that his debt didn't disappear just because he was in a cell. He said I'd signed his death warrant, and he hoped I enjoyed the restaurants while I still could. I looked at him and felt a strange sense of peace. The threats didn't scare me anymore. I told him that I'd already survived the worst thing he could do to me, and nothing the world threw at me now could compare to the loss of my son. He was hauled through the door, the heavy metal clanging shut behind him with a finality that felt like a tomb. I walked out into the bright August afternoon, the heat vibrating off the pavement. Maria was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps, a small, hopeful smile on her face. We walked together toward the subway, two people who had been brought together by a betrayal and stayed together by choice. She told me the Crown Heights location was doing better than ever, that the staff loved the new management style, and that the customers were returning in droves. I realized that while I'd lost a son, I'd gained a daughter in spirit, someone who saw the man I was and not the bank I owned. That evening, I returned to the Brooklyn brownstone and sat in the kitchen. I opened the drawer where I'd hidden the photos of Rick and Emma. I looked at them one last time. Then I walked to the fireplace and dropped them into the small grate. I watched the edges curl and blacken, the smiles of my family turning to ash in the orange flames. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of survival. I needed the ghosts to stop haunting the hallways so I could hear the city outside again. I sat in Margaret's chair and watched the moon rise over the rooftops, the silence of the house no longer feeling like an invitation to despair. The phone on the table buzzed, a soft, familiar sound. I picked it up, expecting a business call or a check-in from Maria. Instead, it was a message from an encrypted number. It said, "The debt is settled. You owe us nothing. Enjoy your peace, Mr. Miller." I stared at the screen, my pulse spiking. I realized then that Maria hadn't just saved my life from Rick. She had sources of her own, a network of people who saw the furniture of the world and knew exactly how to move the pieces. I put the phone down, my hands steady for the first time in months, and realized that justice doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in a text message. Life in Brooklyn began to take on a new rhythm, one defined by the clatter of plates and the hum of honest work. Every morning at 10 a.m., I met Maria at the Crown Heights restaurant to review the books and plan the week. She was a natural leader, her quiet authority earning the respect of the kitchen staff and the regulars alike. We didn't talk about the trial much, but the bond between us was visible in the way we moved through the space, a shared understanding of what it meant to build something on a foundation of truth. I felt Margaret's presence in every corner of that restaurant, her approval a warm breeze that kept me moving forward when the weight of the past felt too heavy. In September, a letter arrived from the prison in upstate New York. I recognized Rick's handwriting immediately, the same loops and slants from the thank you notes Margaret used to make him write as a child. I held the envelope over the trash can for a long time, the paper feeling heavy with potential poison. But curiosity, or perhaps a final shred of fatherly hope, made me open it. It wasn't an apology. It was a demand for money, a list of items he needed for protection inside. He spoke about the unfairness of the sentence and how I owed him for the years he'd spent waiting for his inheritance. I didn't feel the sting of the words this time. I only felt a profound, echoing pity for a man who could never see past his own reflection. I took the letter to the restaurant and showed it to Maria. She read it silently, her face a mask of concentration. When she finished, she handed it back and told me that some people are like broken glass. No matter how much you try to put them back together, they only exist to cut you. She was right. I realized that my son hadn't just tried to poison my whiskey. He had tried to poison my future with his relentless entitlement. I took the letter to the back of the kitchen and dropped it into the industrial shredder, the sound of the paper being torn to confetti a satisfying punctuation mark on that chapter of my life. Business was booming, and for the first time in years, I found myself enjoying the success without the shadow of Rick's investment opportunities hanging over me. I started a scholarship fund for the children of my employees, a way to ensure that the legacy Margaret and I built would continue to do good long after I was gone. I named it the Margaret and Maria Foundation, a tribute to the two women who had defined my life, one through love and the other through courage. When the news hit the local papers, I received dozens of letters of support, a reminder that Brooklyn takes care of its own. As the first frost hit the city in November, I received a final phone call from Detective Harrison. He told me that Rick had been involved in a prison altercation, not as a victim, but as a coordinator for an illegal gambling ring inside the walls. His sentence had been extended by another 5 years, and he'd been moved to a high-security wing with no visitation rights for the foreseeable future. Harrison told me he thought I should know so I could stop looking over my shoulder. I thanked him and hung up, looking out at the Brooklyn Bridge as it glowed against the night sky. I didn't feel relief, and I didn't feel joy. I just felt finished. The holiday season arrived with a flurry of snow and a sense of warmth I hadn't felt in years. On Christmas Eve, I hosted a dinner for the managers and their families at the Queens location, the one named after Margaret. The room was filled with laughter, the smell of roasted garlic, and the bright, chaotic energy of children running between the tables. Maria sat at the head of the table next to me, her family having flown in from Mexico to join us. As I looked around the room, I realized that this was the family I'd been searching for all along, not one bound by blood and betrayal, but one built on respect and shared labor. I stood up to make a toast, the crystal glass in my hand filled with sparkling cider instead of whiskey. I looked at the faces of the people who kept my dream alive every day, the chefs, the servers, the dishwashers, and Maria. I told them that Margaret used to say that a restaurant isn't just a place to eat, it's a place to find your way back to yourself. I thanked them for being my family when I had none, and for showing me that honor is a choice you make every morning when you put on your apron. We drank together, the sound of the toast echoing through the dining room like a bell of clear, bright hope. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the kitchen was quiet, I walked through the restaurant one last time. I touched the brass railing of the bar and the smooth mahogany of the tables, feeling the history of 40 years of hard work in the wood. I found myself at the back of the room, looking at a small photo of Margaret that hung near the entrance. She was smiling, her eyes crinkled at the corners, and I could almost hear her voice telling me that I'd done well. I'd protected the legacy, I'd honored the truth, and I'd found a way to turn a nightmare into a new beginning. I walked out into the cold Brooklyn night, the snow crunching under my boots. The city was quiet for once, the streetlights casting long blue shadows across the drifts. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone vibrate. A simple text from Maria wishing me a Merry Christmas and reminding me we were meeting at 9 a.m. on Monday to finalize the new menu. I smiled, the cold air stinging my cheeks in a way that made me feel alive. I wasn't running anymore, and I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was just a man heading home to a house that was no longer empty because it was filled with the memory of a good life and the promise of a better one. I reached my front door and paused, looking up at the stars through the gaps in the brownstone roofs. I thought about the text message I'd received during that dinner in Montclair, the words that had shattered my world so they could be rebuilt into something stronger. "Get up and go now," it had said, and I had. I'd gone toward the truth, toward justice, and finally, toward peace. I stepped inside, turned the lock, and felt the warmth of the hallway envelop me like a long overdue embrace. The story of the betrayal was over, and the story of the rest of my life was just beginning to be written in the quiet, honest hours of the morning. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you are here.